Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hagel, his visit to Jerusalem critical, onto the Gulf to talk about arms packages and to make controversial statements about Syria and red lines and lethal chemical weapons. But in between, a stop in Cairo, and we circle Cairo right now as the capital of a failing state. Egypt, 80 million people, the centerpiece of the Ummah, the Islamic community. And the questions about Egypt describe the worry about the Arab Spring and what we're seeing in all the states east and west of Egypt. The failure in Cairo is a failure of a whole understanding of how to rule with Sharia law simultaneously with relationships or treaties or exchanges or foreign aid with the West. It is a paradox. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations, joins me. Good evening, Malcolm.
Good evening, John.
We'll move on to Jordan momentarily, but we're going to start in Cairo. You know very well why. David Schenker of the Washington Institute program, he leads the program on Arab politics, joins us. David, good evening to you. Mr. Hagel's time in Cairo, the conversation, it wasn't about tanks and high-performance aircraft. It was about whether the government is reliable. Does Mr. Hagel's visit tell you one way or t'other whether Mr. Morsi has the possibility of repairing what we see now as rapid deterioration? Good evening, David.
Good evening, John. Good evening, Malcolm. No, not at all. I think what we saw was very terse statements about Hagel both supporting the government of Egypt and echoing the importance of the bilateral relationship, and an expression of concern about the nature of governance and the economic situation. Very little detail beyond that.
Did you sense the growing division between Hamas and Egypt getting attention during this visit? The public statements, we've seen a whole series of events blaming them for the killing of the people in Tahrir Square, the talk of a new route between Sudan and Hamas, and the Egyptians obviously caught in the middle. What role did this play during the talks?
Well, it's hard to know what happened behind closed doors, and typically this doesn't seem like a discussion for the Secretary of Defense to be having, either with his defense counterpart or with the President of Egypt, for that matter. There is obviously some differences of opinion between the Muslim Brotherhood presidency and government of Egypt and Hamas next door. There are two wings of the Muslim Brotherhood, but they have different interests, and Egypt right now doesn't want to see the situation in Sinai spiral out of control, and this is something that matters very much to them, not only because of the bilateral security relationship with the United States and the peace treaty with Israel, but because of the increasing lawlessness in Egypt and the threat of spiraling out of control and an end of the tourism industry in the country.
Detail, David, and it's in your piece that you write with Eric Traeger. There is plenty of information that the Muslim Brothers are now putting their members into the military academies. That is easily understood as a way of taking over the resistance of the state within a state, the military. That may be a sign of strength for the Muslim Brothers, but is it sustainable? Will the military put up with it, or will they push back? We're all watching for when the military makes its move.
Well, it's a great question. We don't have this sort of inner view, this transparency, or this view into the military about exactly what's happening. Traditionally, the military has opposed the Islamization. You hear stories about military officers who wouldn't ever let their wives wear hijab, even though they were more conservative, because this would stigmatize them. They wouldn't get promotions. And all of a sudden, the ambiance is changing with Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood rising in Egypt. Even within the police force, there is now a campaign called "I am a policeman with a beard" to sort of indicate that this is something that is more acceptable. And obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to brotherhoodize the country to make it more Islamist. They're starting with the education system. They're going to the police, and they're also working on the military. There may be a backlash here, but we may be seeing a process like what happened in Turkey, where it took 10 years, but essentially at the end, the military was brought to heel.
Let's talk a little bit about the articles you've written of late about Jordan. I did meet King Abdullah when he was here, and I know that you followed his visit very carefully. What do you think the conclusion of the visit is? Did it strengthen the ties? Did they come with some solution for the immense and growing Syrian refugee problem?
Well, the King, the United States, and Jordan have excellent strategic relationship. We have very strong financial relationship. Jordan is an excellent partner for the United States in the region. I'm sure the King came. From what I've heard, he's asked for additional funding. I think the administration is going to come in with $200 million for the refugees to go to UNHCR, the High Commission on Refugees, to provide Jordan some relief. You know, they want $1 billion. They said $500 million last year. They're going to spend $500 million this year. This is a huge problem for a government with a 30% budget deficit. They have a lot of problems, and they're also looking for a little bit of U.S. support on the security side about helping with contingency planning should WMD be used, and also some coordination. I don't think the King walk away with anything other than $200 million.
And what about the training program being expanded to fill the void should the day after, or the growing concern about Al-Qaeda's presence near the Jordanian-Israeli borders? Does this become the core of the strategic planning now?
Well, this is certainly some of it. You know, there was, I think, a regrettable leak of some information about, I think it was Secretary Hagel who said in testimony that we were going to put 200 Special Forces troops for contingency planning in Jordan. It's no news that the United States has hundreds of troops in Jordan. We've had that for a long time. But when you announce it, you're drawing attention to it, and now you have weeks of protest in Jordan about the presence of U.S. troops, and even people writing a petition saying that U.S. troops on Jordanian soil were a legitimate target. That said, you know, this is an issue. The King's going to need help with it. He's got, you know, already 500,000 close to Syrian refugees living in Jordan. If, for example, Assad takes out the power plant in Daraa, you could have 1 million more Syrian refugees in days flock to the kingdom. And this is a lot for a place with only 6.5 million people. It costs a lot of money, and it's a lot of security issues for the King.
Malcolm, I want to press you on the King as well. We've talked about this for months. Is there any reason to believe that the King is stabilizing the worries about the Muslim Brothers and the Salafists, and now the, what you'd have to say, the Al-Qaeda front that's on his northern border? Is he now evidencing that he's got a control of it that he did not have last fall?
Oh, I would think, and David's articles, I think, and over time, your writings would indicate that, I mean, he's facing a big internal challenge.
Right.
The Muslim Brotherhood, but even the tribes now turning against him, and for the first time targeting him personally. But as long as he remains the unifying factor, he can keep the country together. And now the influx, and he said to us that the 500,000, David, would double within the next year, and they become 10% of the population now, could be 20% of the population in a year, which certainly is untenable.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, Malcolm. And the bigger problem, I think, is not just having all these people in your country, but it's really that you're going to have a country next door that's going to be controlled by, well, Islamists, Salafis, you know, lawlessness, Al-Qaeda taking root, and people coming across the border and doing just like they did in Iraq from 2003 to
Iraq
2007.
scares him.
You know, Al-Qaeda guys coming across the border and attacking Western targets and the regime in Jordan.
David Schenker is the research fellow at the Washington Institute. He's the director of the Arab Studies program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute. Malcolm Hoenlein of the Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. Check those boxes. Cairo doubts. Amman doubts. I'm John Batchelor.